In this video, I want to talk about how the development of Stormcast Eternal's Stormhosts is reflective of a pattern found during the development of the Space Marines in the early years of 40k. I think there's a lot of parallels there. Age of Sigmar is a relatively new game still, it's only a few years old. And there are a lot of similarities in some ways. I think there are more similarities between 40k and Age of Sigmar than there are really between Age of Sigmar and Warhammer Fantasy Battles. And it's interesting to see some of the successes of 40k that at the time may have been fairly spontaneous. I don't know if they had things planned out then. But they probably do have a fairly cohesive plan of how they wanted to develop Age of Sigmar. And Age of Sigmar obviously started fairly simply. The narrative is, already set in place, but they kind of purposely throw out names and they purposely are leaving a lot of details vague and unclear. And some of that is the success of 40k. There are a lot of details still in early 40k history that kind of perplex players about missing legions and things like this that they're just kind of details that were tossed into the story and now are just endless topics for conversation among some gamers. But part of this came about when I recently purchased the Soul Wars box set, the new starter set for Age of Sigmar 2.0. It's a beautiful starter set with many exceptional miniatures. I know a lot of people go straight to the rules and ignore the story. I really do the opposite. I often ignore the rules in favor of the story, because the story universe is what keeps me engaged in the long run, even when I'm not playing games. And I think that they possess longevity. They're obviously prone to change, but they stay with it, even if the narrative is constantly developing and new things are coming up. It still has resonance many years later. And rules often don't have that for me. And I think I've been playing long enough that I'm not as concerned with rules as they currently are a lot of the time. In particular, right now I'm only playing a few games a year, so it almost feels like every time I sit down to play, a new General's Handbook has come out and it's a completely different game anyway. So, it's not something I can really focus on. But I'm interested in how the narrative of AoS is similar to the early years of 40k, when that game was first being developed, because the past is a good predictive model for the future. So, like it or not, there are strong connections between Stormcast in Age of Sigmar and Space Marines in 40k. Both are really the public representation of their respective games. There's not really a good comparison between Stormcast, what the Stormcast do for Age of Sigmar, and what any faction did for Warhammer Fantasy Battle. Chaos would probably be the closest thing to it. But that's both a strong representative in 40k and Age of Sigmar. The Stormcasts are a little bit more iconic. And the image of Space Marines is highly identified with 40k. And now the same is true with Stormcast Eternals and Age of Sigmar. So they both share some similar aesthetics, the design of their armor and appearances, while also still retaining separate fantasy and science fiction elements. Now, there's a lot of criticism initially that these Stormcasts look basically like Space Marines. But the model of Space Marines, the concept of Space Marines works in 40k. And obviously they make a lot of money off Space Marines in 40k. It's not too surprising to use that model in Age of Sigmar. And as I've pointed out in previous videos, the aesthetics of Space Marines is based upon medieval knights. I mean, 40k in my mind has always been a fantasy game in space, so it doesn't surprise me there that there are similarities. But there are also significant narrative differences in what characterizes a Stormcast Eternal and what characterizes a Space Marine. But broadly speaking, they're both superhuman soldiers, so they have that in common. And the Stormhosts of the Stormcast Eternals, they're divided between different so-called strikings. There are some that are created during the first striking, while others created during the second striking. Those that were created by Sigmar first, and then Sigmar created a few others after. Although not identical, they're somewhat similar to they somewhat echo the foundings of these Space Marine chapters. And then, since the end of the Realm Gate Wars in Age of Sigmar, the Stormhosts now essentially have their own permanent base called Storm Keeps. And I cannot help but think that these somehow are fairly similar to the chapter monasteries of the Space Marines. They almost have the same feel. They're not on different planets, but they're in different situations and they function almost identical. There's no recruitment process, and so some of the details are distinctly different, but they echo one another very closely. So, when Age of Sigmar launched, the narrative was driven by the exploits of Bandus Hammerhand and the Hammers of Sigmar as they pushed back the forces of chaos during the very beginning of the Age of Sigmar. And I immediately thought that these were essentially the same as the Ultramarines in 40k. That the Hammers of Sigmar and the Ultramarines are one and the same. They function the exact same way. They have the same type of role within each universe. And they both have recognizable and simple color schemes. The Hammers of Sigmar are, of course, gold and blue, whereas the Ultramarines are depicted with shades of blue. More modern variants are a bit darker than some of the early years. But they both basically capture the essence of their faction. The Hammers of Sigmar are the most iconic Stormhost. They were the first to be forged. They're the largest Stormhost. They lead the fight against chaos. And for the reasons discussed, they're almost certainly the most represented paint scheme for Stormcast Eternals in Age of Sigmar. And a complete comparison here would be inaccurate, as the Ultramarines are from the 8th Legion, but they are from the first founding of Space Marines. And their character is at least somewhat similar. Their Ultramarines are considered to be the most one of the most strongest and most honorable of the Space Marine chapters. So, with a few minor exceptions, the Ultramarines have never really had their own unique rules. There were a few unique rules here and there for when they fought against the Tyranids, so they were like Tyranid veterans and things like this. But for the most part, the organization of the Ultramarines is purely following the Codex Astartes, and so their military organization is established, and they essentially represent the organization of every other, or most other Space Marine chapters. The exceptions being, of course, the chapters that have their own rules, like the Blood Angels and Dark Angels and Space Wolves, and the crazy kind of unique Space Marines that are unlike the vast majority of other Space Marines. In Age of Sigmar, the pattern of the Ultramarines isn't really followed because the Hammers of Sigmar now have some of their own unique rules, so they're not quite the template. But aesthetically and in terms of appearance on the battlefield and things like that, I think there's quite a lot of similarities. So when Age of Sigmar launched, the Stormcast Eternals paved the way, and beyond the gold and blue paint scheme that is fairly represented on many tables, there were a few other possible paint schemes that you could use. These are official paint schemes. Of course, you can paint them however you want, but they depict in the battle tome or codex, whatever you want to call it, different variations on different paint schemes. And variations of paint schemes, whatever they are, have a specific name that represents a unique Stormhost. So you could paint them to represent these other Stormhosts, but at the time they didn't have any rules. So, and this is something that Games Workshop did once before when 40K first launched in the late 80s and early 90s. Rogue Trader was first launched, and shortly thereafter you have the rather iconic Imperial Space Marines box set that you see a lot of people brag about if they ever owned one. And that really quickly followed. And of course, again, you could paint the Space Marines however way you want, but on the side of that box, there were a few featured paint schemes for all the iconic Space Marine chapters we know today, minus, I guess, Rainbow Warriors, which never really caught on. I expect really the same process here for different Stormhosts. And I expected that when Age of Sigmar first launched, and I kind of saw these individual paint schemes. And so far that's actually played out. So initially there were simply paint variants that you could paint different Stormhosts. And essentially, since the initial core book and the few Realm Gate War books and things like that, they've been novels and other Black Library publications that have really fleshed out details for each of these unique Stormhosts, such that they're really developed a character that is not too distinct from some Space Marine chapters. There's I think Astral Claws, the Stormhost Astral Claws, is wearing a lot of animal furs and things like this. It really does remind me of Space Wolves, essentially. Clearly, they're not necessarily werewolves in space, but they have a very rough characteristic to them. So now, in the most recent Stormcast Eternals Battle Tome for 2.0, they've included developed background abilities and command abilities and command traits and artifacts of power for each of the following Stormhosts: the Hammers of Sigmar, the Hallowed Knights, the Celestial Vindicators, Anvils of the Helden Hammer, the Knights Excelsior, Celestial Warbringers, Tempest Lords, and Astral Templars. And going forward, I wouldn't be surprised if some, but probably not all, of these Stormhosts will have their own books, and more importantly to me, maybe their own unique line of models. The Space Wolves, Blood Angels, Dark Angels, etc. are really huge components of the 40K universe. And there are many gamers that are dedicated to those aesthetics, and they're obviously a huge cash cow for Games Workshop too. I mean, these things are incorporated into their into the releases as they kind of go in cycles, and they're huge deals when they come out. In the long term, I could see some of the Stormhosts reaching that level of dedication. And the point is that this is probably an active process. It's part of a long-term strategy on the part of Games Workshop, delivered in specific stages. I don't expect everything to be 100% planned out, but they probably had a rough guideline of what they wanted to do in Age of Sigmar 1.0, 2.0, and probably 3.0 and beyond, of different armies that they want to release and so on. Keep in mind, as has been often said, these models are designed years in advance. The rules are probably designed shortly thereafter, and so they know precisely. They knew that 2.0 was going to be coming out when we were starting to first get into Age of Sigmar 1.0. So this is a process that is a fairly long term, and I think that basically Games Workshop has learned what worked in developing a brand and selling models. And for that reason, I suspect AoS is on a faster track for developing an ever-deepening narrative and universe. Much of this work is being accomplished through the novels and stories produced by the Black Library. It wouldn't make sense when they first launched to have everything fully fleshed out. They had to leave a lot of holes. They had to leave a lot of room for development. So they're just enormous gray areas. And, rightly so, some people were really complaining about how simplistic some of the early narrative really was. I always saw that as being a transitional phase. And I think that that's really panning out. So A while ago, I made a video about the trend toward complexity across different editions. AoS launched with only 4 pages of rules and a fairly simple narrative that explained very little and featured easily recognizable themes, and essentially the trajectory was always set to increase. There's really nowhere to go but up in depth and complexity. And again, as every time you do a reset of these types of rules, it's a doorway to add new people in. It's a way to encourage growth. And even if you're a critic of Age of Sigmar, I mean, you must almost have to admit that the game has been relatively successful, at least in certain parts of the country. It just seems like there's a constant stream now of tournaments and organized play all over the place. And so with 1.1, to go back to my main point, the Stormhosts were really introduced as really no more than alternative color schemes. And of 2.0, they were given now some unique rules. I don't think it's a stretch to predict that 3.0, some Stormhosts might have their own books. Probably, almost certainly, a greater increased developed narrative. I mean, this is just something that comes with time. The more stories that are produced, the more depth that occurs. And I'm actually really hopeful that there'll be some unique models coming out that really define. I would love to see these Stormhosts really have the same character of some of those iconic Space Marine chapters, and reach that level of dedication among some Stormcast Eternals. And just being part of that process and seeing it unfold would be, I think, an interesting thing for me. So we'll see what the future holds, but I think there's a lot of parallels between what has already occurred in 40K. That's it for this video. See you again soon.